think we're in business. Well, thank you very much for coming out. It's nice to see such a large audience this morning. I think a lot of what I'm going to say should be of interest because obviously wellness is critical for everybody. And the main message is that we have a lot of control over our wellness. And so being able to modify your behavior or change your habits can really make a difference. And I know over time I've changed mine dramatically from both a nutritional standpoint and an exercise standpoint. Well, let's start by looking at the 10 leading causes of death because many of them are influenced by both nutrition and exercise. If we start up here, everybody's aware of the fact that cancer and heart disease are the two leading causes of death. One of the things that's kind of interesting, if you look at the gray bar here versus the red bar, it's comparing 2000 to 2012. It's hard, it takes a while to get this data, so we're always a little bit behind. But what I want to point out is that there's a reduction in 2012 over 2000, showing that we are having an impact in reducing these killers. There's a couple of combined categories here: heart disease, stroke. These are obviously related. If you drop down to here, diabetes and Alzheimer's disease, all of these factors are largely affected by diet and exercise. And it's one of the things I want to talk about today. If we look at obesity, which is related to these causes of death as well, because the incidence is much higher if you are overweight or overfat. And if we look at the rate of overweight in the developed countries, the Americans are leading here. If you look at some of these numbers, about 65% of Americans are overweight or overfat, depending on how you define that. And the incidence of these causes of death is much higher in overfat people. But we can't be too smug. We're not far behind here. We're at about 55%. And if you compare that with a few other countries here, if you look at Italy and France, they're substantially less. So we have some way to go in terms of improving where we stand. And as I'll talk about today, we can really affect these things by our habit choices. If you look at diabetes, another major killer, this is really kind of alarming. One in 10 deaths in Canada are attributed to diabetes, either directly or indirectly. About 29% of Canadians have diabetes, and these numbers, alarmingly, are still going up. If you look at some of the predictions, about 33% over the next 6 or 7 years. These figures are kind of startling too if you think in terms of the cost, not only to treat people with diabetes, but in dollars lost from work if you're no longer able to work. The estimate is about 3.4 million today are living with diabetes, and that's about $14 billion in lost revenue. And of course, these are the numbers that they project will go up in the next few years. So these are things that, unlike heart disease and cancer, where we seem to be winning or decreasing the incidence, diabetes and obesity are going up, getting worse. So what I want to talk about today, I'm going to talk a little bit about physical activity and about nutrition. I'm also going to talk about how much sleep you get and if that's a factor in wellness. Something that's become very prevalent in the last 6 or 7 years is the adverse effect of prolonged sitting, which most of us do regularly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This last one, unfortunately, we can't really control, but is a major factor. But I want to talk about the things that we can control, especially if you're in a sex or gender category where these diseases are much higher, then the things you can control are even more important. As a scientist, I'm going to concentrate on objective data. There are all kinds of opinions. There was a reference to Trump He has a lot of opinions. Very few of them seem to be based on actual data. I'm going to try and base my opinions on data. And as I mentioned, behavior modification, or what I refer to as habit change, and a lot of people seem to think that it's difficult to change habits, and I don't share that opinion, especially if you make small changes which progressively over time become big changes. So for instance, if you're totally inactive, what I try and do is get you to take a 5-minute walk after dinner. And I will then ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being absolutely positively I can do that, and 1 being probably I can't do that, I ask them how likely are they to do a 5-minute walk after dinner. And if they don't give me an 8, 9, or 10, then I make that change even less. Can you walk to the corner and back? Because any exercise is better than no exercise. And the thing that happens, as many of you know, when you start to exercise, you feel energized, and pretty soon you're doing a little more walking than you were before. So anything that moves in the direction of where we want to go usually results eventually in the behavior that we need. So habit change is really much easier than a lot of people think, as long as you take it in small pieces. Well, let's talk about sitting. We're sitting right now. If this was my class, because I tell them this the very first class, I have people popping up and down all through the class, because standing is better than sitting, even if it's very short-lived. So let's start out by looking at the amount of sitting that people do. And of course, this is the kind of scenario here. We get in our car, we drive to work, we sit at our desk, we drive home, we sit in front of the computer or the TV, and obviously the hours accumulate. This study shows that about almost 8 hours a day we're sleeping. Given that hopefully we're sleeping part of the day, this is a major part of the day that we're sleeping. And the reason this is alarming, if we look at some studies with large numbers of individuals, over 120,000 people were studied. So this is a very large study over about 14 years. And what they found was that people who sat 6 hours a day or longer had much greater incidence of death from all causes. And in fact, in this 14-year period, women were 94% more likely to die if they sat 6 hours or longer. And men were a little bit less, about almost 50%. The point is, if you're, and I'm not talking about exercise here, that's a separate category I'll get into. I'm just talking about sitting. So we need to sit less. Just to support that point, if we look at a meta-analysis of 18 recent studies and almost 800,000 people, so again, huge numbers of people, there was a 112% increased risk of diabetes in people that sat 6 hours or more. So you'll hear people refer to sitting as the new smoking. We go back to the 60s when people first started to realize through the American Surgeon General that smoking was hazardous. Over the years, we've come to fully appreciate that, and the smoking incidence rates are dramatically reduced. Sitting, on the other hand, people haven't associated it with problems until quite recently. 140%, 47% increased risk of death to or risk of heart attack or stroke, 90% increased risk of dying of a heart attack or stroke, and 49% increased risk of dying prematurely from all causes. So the more you sit, the greater the chance of dying from any one of these causes. So what are the solutions? Well, this is the one that I tell my students, the so-called 20-20 rule. For every 20 minutes of sitting, we'd like you to stand for at least 20 seconds. So if anybody wants to pop up and down, if you're able to do that, you're welcome. Again, following the trend of this small habit change, there are things you can do. Maybe if you're watching TV or working on the computer, you can stand up periodically. Maybe during a commercial, stand, and then when the commercial's over, sit down. Maybe when you get a phone call, you can stand. It'll maybe keep your phone calls shorter too if you're standing. Regular walks, and we've started to do this now where we do walking meetings. If somebody wants to come to my office to meet with me, I'll usually say, no, I'll come to your office, because I'd rather get the exercise. So there's a number of things you can do. If you have trouble doing this, get a dog. It's amazing how people will walk their dog when they won't walk themselves. If you got to walk the dog 2 or 3 times a day, it's a good way to get exercise. I have a colleague who at the end of every talk that he gives, he'll say, and remember to walk the dog, even if you don't have a dog. If you got to go to the corner grocery store, why not walk instead of driving? I'm not suggesting you walk 10 miles, but if it's half a mile, get in a little bit of walking, and carrying the groceries on the way back is a little bit of strength exercise. Is beneficial as well. I mentioned about walking meetings, standing desks. A lot of people are now purchasing standing desks so they can actually stand instead of sitting all day long, and that's recommended. I don't use elevators unless I'm going about 20, 30 floors. So high rises, and even those I'll stop a couple of floors early and walk the rest of the way. Any chance I get to walk. It was mentioned that I coach the women's softball team. When we go places in airports, I don't use those walking sidewalks. All of my athletes do. And I walk alongside of them and usually get to where the end of the walkway before they do. So then someone will say, Coach, how come you never take the walking sidewalk or the moving sidewalk? And I simply say, why would I pass up a chance to get some exercise? So then the next time they're walking beside me. Of course, we want to get regular exercise on top of this standing versus sitting. But I want to point out that even if you regularly exercise, you're not immune to these adverse effects of prolonged sitting. So you might be thinking, well, I belong to a fitness group, I exercise 3 times a week, so I don't have to worry about sitting. Actually, you can undo some of the benefits, health benefits of exercise by prolonged sitting. So even if you exercise, it's good to be standing periodically. You can get little watches that will vibrate every 20 minutes or every 30 minutes, whatever you set, to remind you that it's time to stand up for 20, 30 seconds. So there's a lot of ways you can do this. Well, many of you know some of these things, but I thought I'd just show you because the evidence is overwhelming about the health benefits of exercise. So let's just review a couple of them here. Decreases in all-cause mortality. So the death rate decreases if you're physically active. To me, that's enough reason to be active on its own, but there's many other ones. There's increases in cognitive function or decreases in the loss of cognitive function, which we all go through as we age, and some people more rapidly than others, and some people earlier than others. And this evidence is overwhelming. In terms of Alzheimer's disease and many other diseases can be not eliminated, but the impact reduced in people who are regularly physically active. Improvements in fat metabolism. Well, we talked about the problem of obesity. Exercise contributes, although not as much as diet, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. It also reduces or produces a more favorable blood lipid profile, which is associated with reduced heart disease and stroke. It has some positive effects on the blood vessels that reduces heart disease and stroke as well. It reduces pro-inflammatory markers. These are things that are very closely associated with heart disease. Improves insulin sensitivity. That's the cause of diabetes, at least type 2 diabetes, which is the major form of diabetes. Over 90% of diabetics are type 2 diabetics. It's not that they don't produce insulin, it's that the body doesn't respond to it. In fact, they produce more insulin than normal people, but it just doesn't do its job. If you're physically active, your insulin sensitivity goes way up, and that reduces the incidence of not only diabetes, but obesity. even reduces several types of cancer. And from a practical standpoint, it makes it easier to do the things that you have to do every day. I mentioned walking to the grocery store and being able to carry bags of groceries. That will enable you to be able to keep doing that, as opposed to having to have someone else do it for you because you're not strong enough. So if you raise your capacity a little bit, then what you need to do regularly, climbing stairs, carrying things, become well within your capacity. And then you can continue to do those things into old age. Very important factor here, it was mentioned about balance. We know clearly balance decreases as we age, and that contributes to falls. And falls can obviously cause injury. I know people who are very worried about leaving the house because they're afraid they're going to fall. So they become kind of restricted because of the fear of falling. Well, exercise dramatically improves balance and therefore is kind of like a rejuvenation. And I could go on and on. There's many, many benefits of exercise. So everybody should be physically active. Whether it causes a change in your body fat content or not, it promotes health and wellness. Well, what about the effects on obesity? Because people are always saying, well, I'm a little bit overweight, I'm just going to exercise more. Well, sadly, it doesn't have a very big impact, especially in women. So despite what many believe, exercise often doesn't reduce body fat significantly, especially in women. Let's take a look at some data here. This graph is women, this graph is men, and what is being plotted here is a weight change over a 16-month period of exercise. Each bar represents an individual participant. So these individuals, these women, all actually increased weight over that 16 months that they implemented an exercise program. Now, of course, some of this is actually a change in muscle mass, which is a good thing. But the point is, a lot of people start an exercise program to lose weight thinking they're losing fat, and in fact, at least half of them actually gained weight, and some of them a substantial amount here, about 9 to 10 kilograms. It's not necessarily a bad thing, as I said, because an increase in muscle mass has a lot of positive benefits. Several women in the middle here really didn't change much at all, and a few lost a little bit of weight. Some of this might have been muscle, though, so it's not necessarily good. And even the woman who lost the most weight was only about 5 kilos or about 11 pounds. For people who are really over fat, losing 11 pounds over 16 months would be considered pretty unimportant. Men, on the other hand, seem to do a little bit better, more consistently lose weight and a lot more. But we still had one here who didn't really change and one who actually gained. So the answer to becoming lean is not just exercising more. It can contribute, but it's a relatively minor contributor. What you eat, when you eat, and how much you eat is way more a factor. So why is this? Well, first of all, there's a huge difference between men and women, and there's a huge difference between individuals. Some people will lose a lot more weight, a lot more fat than others with exercise. And if you look at this as sort of a typical fast food meal, and I don't mean to pick on McDonald's because they're all pretty much the same, a relatively small meal can amount to quite a few calories. I know a lot of young individuals who will consume this in the evening as a snack, which becomes essentially another meal. On the other hand, if you exercise, and let's say you exercise for an hour, at a fairly high pace, we're talking about somewhere between about 200 and 400 calories, depending upon your actual size and how hard you exercise. The point is, it's a very small amount of calories relative to the amount that you can eat. And so you can undo the benefits of exercise from a calorie balance standpoint by eating too much. And unfortunately, most Canadians don't do this, and they do a lot of this. And the end result is that 55% of us are over fat. So it's not me, so that means it must be one of you, because it's 1 in every 2. This area here I want to mention a little bit about too, compensation. What I mean there is that a lot of times people, through their behavior, they compensate. They exercise, and so they say, well, I exercise today so I can have those 2 extra beers, or I can have that extra hamburger, or whatever the case may be, and they actually overcompensate. They expend a couple hundred calories in their exercise bout, and they eat 1,200 in the overcompensation. So they're going in the wrong direction. Some will actually decrease their spontaneous physical activity. And what I mean by that is not actual exercise, but just activity that you do throughout the day. When you walk up and down stairs going to somebody else's office, or when you walk around the university. That's spontaneous physical activity. So what some people will do when they work out is they'll say, well, I worked out today, so I'm just going to lie on the couch and watch 2 movies this afternoon. So instead of the regular activity that you get during the afternoon, it's dramatically reduced because you think you expended so many calories when you're exercising. Spontaneous physical activity is actually a very significant part of weight control. And if you simply increase that by using the stairs, by walking instead of using the moving sidewalk, that will add up to a significant amount of energy over the course of the day or the week. And so it's something to think about. Again, minor habit changes contributing to more energy expenditure is worthwhile. More recently, we've looked at exercise type, as have several others, and it turns out that although endurance exercise, or sort of slow, prolonged exercise, is health promoting, other types of exercise, including strength, where we use a little bit of weightlifting, or sprint interval or high intensity interval exercise that I'm going to talk about in a minute, but briefly, it's much more intense and very short exercise repeated, seems to have even greater health benefits and greater benefits for fat loss than this sort of slow 20, 30, 60-minute exercise. So all exercise is good, but some exercise might be even better. And one of the things that makes it better is that this more intense exercise has lasting effects after you stop exercising. Whereas this slower, more moderate exercise that many of us did for years, the benefits really end when you stop exercising. The increase in metabolic rate is confined to the 20, 30 minutes that you're doing the exercise. Whereas if you do more intense exercise, there's an increase in metabolic rate for a prolonged period of time after you stop. So there's a number of variable types of exercise that may affect your health differently. Something else I want to talk about here is this weight cycling, and I don't mean bicycling here. I mean when your weight drops and then it increases and then it drops. You see some actors and actresses will do this quite frequently. You see them one time and they're very lean, and next time they're really overweight and they're back and forth. This kind of weight cycling behavior is really not good for your health. It turns out that if you lose a lot of weight and regain it just one time, the tendency to do that again is increased. And the reason is that when you lose weight, unless you do it systematically and using appropriate methods, you lose some muscle as well as fat. And then when you regain the weight, it's much harder to regain the muscle that you've lost, so you usually just regain the fat. And this causes problems in terms of changes in body composition, leading to increased obesity and increased cardiovascular risk. So you really don't want to be overweight and then lean and then overweight and lean back and forth. And that's what happens if you don't really understand what you need to do to stay lean. And what you need to do involves both regular exercise and nutritional changes. So we can put anybody in a metabolic ward in a hospital and restrict their food intake and force them to exercise, and the fat will drop off. So let's look a little bit at the relationship between sleep and obesity. This is interesting. If you look at years going back to the early 1900s, and you look at average sleep, there wasn't much data back here. Most of the data started about 1960, but the numbers were quite a bit reduced in terms of hours of sleep for average, this is American data, versus earlier data. And it might have been because there was a lot more labor-intensive jobs and people slept more because they needed more rest. But whatever the reason, we seem to sleep less, and the tendency seems to be decreasing even more to maybe about 7 hours a day now, as opposed to more like about 9 or more in the past. And the interesting thing is if you plot over here the prevalence of obesity, as sleep has gone down, obesity has gone up. It doesn't mean it's a cause and effect relationship, it's just related. If you sleep less, you tend to be fatter. But when you observe something like that, it's good to systematically look at it and see if there is some relationship, and it turns out that there is. If you look at some data from sleep labs, here's an experiment where they took 10 overweight participants, 7 men and 3 women, and they slept on average about 7.7 hours a night. And in the sleep lab, they, over 2 weeks, manipulated the amount of sleep that they could get. So these people came in and actually lived in the lab for a couple weeks. They slept either 8.5 hours or they woke them up after 5.5 hours. I wouldn't volunteer for this study, but they also controlled diet and exercise because they wanted to see the impact on obesity, and we know those things affect it. So they fed them a low-energy diet, so a little bit less energy than they were expending because they were trying to decrease body fat. So you'll recognize these numbers are pretty low in the two groups, a little bit under 1,500 calories a day. That's a low intake, and it was about 90% of the expenditure that they had during the day if they didn't do any exercise, just if they sat around at rest. So you would expect them to lose weight on that diet. They controlled energy output to make sure there was a deficit, so they didn't have them sit around. They had them do a little bit of exercise, and they were actually expending about 2,100 calories. And you see both groups were very similar because they were controlling that. So their caloric intake was a little less than 1,500, and their expenditure was a little more than 2,100, so you'd expect them to lose some weight. Over the course of the study, they measured body composition, and the overall weight loss was similar between the two groups, which by itself would suggest that the amount of sleep doesn't really matter. However, when they broke down the composition of the weight loss, the individuals who have the 8.5 hours of sleep lost 133% more fat. That amounted to about almost a kilo and a half of body fat over the 2 weeks versus about half a kilo. So much more body fat loss and less muscle loss. So often when you undereat, if you don't exercise sufficiently, you'll lose muscle as well as fat. And you don't want to do that because muscle is very important for health. In fact, a lot of people think that the loss in muscle mass as we age has a lot to do with our decrease in wellness. And that's why strength programs are so important, to try and retain as much of that muscle as you can. So the muscle loss was greater in the 5.5 hour sleepers. So the people who slept less over just a very short time period lost more muscle and less fat. So they looked into why this was, and one of the things was the short sleepers, the 5.5-hour sleepers, were actually hungrier, but they didn't let them eat more. They restricted their food intake. However, if this was a regular person out there sleeping less and you're hungrier, you're likely going to eat more food and make it even worse. The short sleepers also utilize less fat for energy. So right now, as we're sitting here or standing, we're using some fat for energy. And the short sleepers, because of some hormonal changes, actually use less fat than the longer sleepers. So going from 8.5 to 5.5 in this controlled setting had some adverse effects which over time could be very significant relative to health. One of the things they discovered was if you have less than 8 hours, most people have altered hormones in the GI tract. You've probably heard of leptin and ghrelin. These are thought to be some of the hormones that control your brain in terms of whether you're hungry or not, and therefore influencing how much you eat. And if you sleep less than 8 hours, there's an increase in appetite. Again, this feeling that you're hungry, which under normal circumstances leads to more food intake, and increase in calories. That resulted in increased fat storage and a reduction of lipolysis, which means how much fat we're using on a regular basis. So these changes all would promote an increase in body fat. So it looks like that apparent relationship is actually cause and effect. There are some changes in gut hormones which lead to you overeating if you sleep too much. So let's talk a little bit about some dietary factors here. Caloric restriction, as the name would imply, is what most people do when they want to lose some body weight. They restrict what they're eating. They eat less calories or less energy. If you do this in control studies in the laboratory, and it's been done in all kinds of organisms, including right up to primates, which are obviously our closest relatives, if you restrict intake by about a third, there are all kinds of health benefits. One of them is that we're physically smaller if you restrict energy intake across the lifespan. These are some of the benefits, and they're all health promoting. Decreases in blood pressure. If blood pressure is abnormal, it tends to go down. That's a positive health benefit. Improvements in insulin sensitivity, which is a health benefit. Reductions in diabetes. Favorable changes in blood fats that are associated with heart disease. Decreases in coronary artery disease, cancer. Decreases in body mass, as I said, we're physically smaller. Decreases in fat, and some decreases in muscle mass. Unfortunately, this is not probably the best strategy for humans, though, because it's very impractical. If I was to ask how many people have tried to diet in this way, probably everybody in the room would raise their hand, but it doesn't work. You can't go through life starving or hungry. You can do it for a while if you're really motivated, so you lose weight, but you lose some muscle as well, and then you eat more normally and you regain it all back, but the weight you gain is fat, not muscle, so you're worse off than you were before. So if you're going to do this, you got to do it forever. You can't do it, go back, do it back and forth. It doesn't work. So it's not really practical, so I don't recommend it. There are some interesting new ideas in the last 5 or 10 years, though. One of them is what's been referred to as intermittent fasting. And I got really interested in this, and I'll show you why in a moment. But the main reason is this is probably how our ancestors ate. And what I mean by intermittent fasting is that we don't eat regularly like most Western people do, in terms of nobody goes a couple hours without eating. They're always snacking or eating meals, constant influx of energy. But our ancestors, who were hunters and gatherers, ate much less regularly and went prolonged periods without eating and had huge energy expenditures because when they were gathering and hunting, they couldn't just walk 10 feet to the refrigerator, they had to go miles. And the estimate is that they were probably covering 15 to 20 miles a day looking for food, a little bit less than what we do. So intermittent fasting is a variation on caloric restriction that's much more practical. In fact, I've been doing this for 5 years, and it wasn't difficult. So it's quite easy to do, and there are a couple of variations on this. One is a so-called 5 and 2 approach, where you eat normally 5 days a week, and you restrict food intake to about 25% of your normal intake on 2 days of the week. So say maybe Monday and Thursday you restrict food intake, and you eat normally the other 5 days. That has quite dramatic positive effects on body fat loss and health benefits associated with that. Some people have tried an alternate day approach where you eat normally today and you reduce to about 25% of what you normally eat tomorrow, then you eat normally and you just go back and forth like that. Both of these approaches have been studied in the laboratory under controlled conditions and in general have a significant effect on fat loss. It's more in some people than others, so it's not all the same. You do have individual variation, but it seems to work. This is the one that I've tried, and again, I'll show you why in a minute, but within 1 day, usually there's a period of time people select about 16 hours where you fast. So essentially, you eat the food intake that you normally consume during 8 hours of the day, and you fast the rest of the time. You do drink normally 0-calorie beverages, though, throughout the day because we don't want to become dehydrated. So as I said, this is the one that I tried, and I lost 25 pounds in the first month. I weigh about 165 now, which is what I weighed when I was in high school. And I had sort of crept up to about 185, 190 until I tried this, and then I went back over a month. And as I said, that was 5 years ago. It's interesting, as I said, because it's much like what our ancestors did, and it might mean that our genes are programmed for this type of food intake, and we've changed that. And one of the reactions is that we get really over fat and all these adverse effects. So if we change, maybe we can get rid of those things, or at least minimize them. This is really key, though. You want to drink water or tea or coffee, some 0-calorie beverage. It has to be black coffee, by the way. If you put a whole bunch of sugar and milk in there, that changes it, because the body's responding to very low carbohydrate intake. We think this is the beneficial effect. If you go 16 hours, your body uses up its carbohydrate stores well within that period and has to find energy somewhere else. Well, even the leanest person in this room has enough fat to be able to survive for days or weeks. And so the body will rapidly shift over and use fat. For example, I lost 2.5 inches off my waist when I did this. Sometimes we can even supplement it with a few particular supplements that enhance the health benefits. But even just the intermittent fasting seems to work. I want to show you some animal data that is very convincing and led me to thinking this might be something that you might want to try. As you probably know, rodents, or mice in this case, are nocturnal. So they're awake during the evenings. They tend to, in the laboratory, have a 12-hour dark cycle and a 12-hour light cycle because it's controlled. And they're active during the night. So what was done in this study was, during the dark cycle, which was 12 hours, for 8 hours of it, they opened up the food tray so that they could eat. The other group was fed ad libitum, which just means the food tray was available 24 hours a day. They could eat whenever they wanted. There was actually a high-fat diet and a normal diet, but I'll skip over that. I just want to show you, if you take a look here on the left side, this is food intake. This is the dark cycle, And this little yellow bar here is the period when the food was available to the one group. The other group got it all the time. So the black line here is the group that only got food in here. So they have no food intake here or here because they can't get access to the food. During this 8 hours, though, they had access to the food, and you can see that the food intake goes up and then drops down. All the food is consumed during that 8 hours because it has to be. The other animals ate sort of systematically throughout the day, sometimes a little bit more at night. Remember here, a lot of this time they're sleeping, but they would wake up and eat and nibble a little bit and then go back to sleep. I don't know many of you who do that. I know some bodybuilders who do that. But so the pattern of eating was very different. So what did they find? Well, first of all, the amount of food that was consumed in all of the different groups, whether it was the A here, these two groups stands for ad libitum, so they were eating whenever they wanted, like most of us do. And the T is time restricted, like I do, eating just in an 8-hour period. And you can see that the animals all ate the same amount of food. So even though they were restricted, they quickly learned they got to eat within the 8 hours. Incidentally, most humans, when they do this, they end up eating less. Not because they're trying to, but they're just not as hungry. And that's one of the benefits of why, or one of the reasons why this works. I eat less now than I did before, but not because I'm trying to restrict. I'm just not as hungry. And so if I undereat, then I lose fat if I'm over fat. So I want to show you the difference in body composition over time. Oh, I should point out one thing first. This is a graph of body weight over the 16 weeks of the study, or 18 weeks of the study, in the different groups. This group here is the animals that had the high-fat diet and could eat it whenever they wanted. So in other words, that's the diet that most Canadians eat. And you can see that they got pretty big relative to the other groups. The other group that was on the exact same diet but was time restricted are significantly smaller, the two red lines. The blue lines is the healthy diet. Those that ate whenever they wanted, though, were still bigger than those that were time restricted. And if we look at body composition, all of the groups except the high-fat ad libitum, so the ones that eat the Canadian diet, were substantially fatter. The red here is the fatter. So the fact that they're bigger, they weren't bigger and stronger, they were bigger and fatter. And the thing that really impressed me was a picture. These are the same age animals. These are brothers or sisters. This is the one that ate the high-fat diet but 8 hours a day. And this is the one that nibbled whenever they wanted. Remember, they ate exactly the same amount of food. So it has to do with how you're handling this food. And the interesting experiment that really convinced me was then they took these animals and they switched the diets. So these guys got the time-restricted one. These ones got the ad libitum. These ones then got fat. These ones then got lean. So whichever direction you're going, it seems to work. I'm going to skip over a couple of these things because I get a lot of questions about this. How do you function when you haven't eaten for 16 hours? People say, I couldn't do that. I wouldn't be able to think. Actually, if you look at intermittent fasting in the brain, your cognitive function actually goes up during the period when you're fasting. And it makes sense when you think about it, because if our ancestors ate intermittently, and if their brain function went down when they were hungry, the chances of finding food would actually be reduced, and they wouldn't survive and wouldn't pass those genes on. The individuals who got a little bit smarter and actually found food would survive and pass those genes on. So we're at the very long end of a long period of evolution. So we inherited genes that would likely do this. And it turns out, with many studies on cognitive function, if you're a little bit hungry, you actually perform better. The mechanism seems to be some changes in brain chemistry that actually mimic what happens with exercise, which we know to be positive. Remember, I talked about exercise improving cognitive function. We think intermittent fasting does a very similar thing. Perhaps both are a challenge, and over time the brain adapts. Some studies that we're doing currently that you might be interested in, we wondered if there's a different time in the day when this might actually work. So if you're going to restrict to 8 hours, you can do it by skipping breakfast and just eating lunch and dinner, or you could obviously do it by skipping dinner, just eating breakfast and lunch to get your food all within that 8-hour time period. And again, most of us just eat, you know, during the whole waking hours. There is some theoretical suggestion that dinner skipping is better, and our pilot work so far in about 15 subjects supports that the time of day that you do this matters. And the reason is that thermic effect of food is nothing more than when you eat, in order to digest the food, your calorie burning goes up, your metabolic rate goes up. And it goes up more when you eat during the daylight hours than it does after dark. That's kind of interesting. I'll talk about why in a minute. The other thing is insulin resistance is greater after dark than it is during the daylight hours. So insulin sensitivity, which is how we get rid of the glucose and not storing it as fat, is actually improved during the light hours. So if you were to dinner skip and eat all your food during the light hours, it seems to be better. And our data is supporting that, but we're still conducting research on this because there is some individual differences. We think what's happening here is, again, if you go back to our ancestors, they did everything during the light hours because there was no artificial light. When the sun went down, they went to bed. When it came up, they got up. So they hunted and gathered and ate during the light hours. Again, I'm not sure that we're that much different, except that we create artificial light. So we're eating at midnight and 2 in the morning during periods when we don't handle food the same way as we do during the light hours. And chronically over time, that leads to increases in body fat. I know I'm just about out of time, so I want to mention one more thing here, because the ketogenic diet has become really popular. And if you haven't heard of it, it's essentially a diet that's much higher in fat than people normally consume. Most of our lifetimes, we've been told to eat less fat. From the 80s on, there was a real push to do that. And that was an absolute disaster because low-fat diets, out of necessity, have to be high-carbohydrate diets. And high-carbohydrate diets are really problematic unless you're really physically active, and very few of us are. So high carbohydrate leads to high body fat. The increase in obesity since the 1980s, when we really moved to these high carbohydrate, low fat diets, has skyrocketed, as has the incidence of heart disease and some cancers. So what happens on a ketogenic diet? And we're talking here about 70, maybe 75% fat. A really, really high fat diet. You can see in a controlled study here, and there are many of these, versus a low fat diet, that the ketogenic diet is actually beneficial in terms of fat loss. What's a ketogenic diet? And I'll finish with this. Basically, a lot of fats and oils, a lot of meats and fish, high in protein, only some types of vegetables, lots of dairy, lots of nuts and seeds, and a lot of water. So we're restricting carbohydrate. The benefit of the high fat, I think, is more the low carbohydrate than the high fat. So 2 take-home messages here. High fat is not nearly as bad as you thought. It may not even be bad at all. And low carbohydrate is really good. So when you go to higher fat, you have to go very low carbohydrate. Most of these ketogenic diets are about 5% carbohydrate, whereas many of you are probably eating more like 40 to 50% carbohydrate. And that low carbohydrate is really beneficial. So this is my passion. I could go on forever, but I know we need to end, and I want to leave some time for questions. So I think, is there going to be a short break and then questions, or we go right to questions?
Yes, we're going to have a non-coffee break.
Okay.
Yeah, right, because, well, that's what we're going to do. Probably give the people 10 minutes.
Okay. And if anyone has any questions about exercise, which I just glossed over, I'd be happy to go into that as well.
No, again, thank you, Dr. Lemon. It was fascinating.